Is he begging for scraps? This isn't a soup kitchen. The words rang out, sharp and cruel, in the crowded space. And at that very moment, Patrick Grant, the CEO of the renowned buffet chain Iron Skillet, froze on the spot. He wasn't standing in a boardroom, not sitting in a high-rise office, but lining up like any other customer, with an old hoodie pulled low over his eyes, an empty plastic tray in his hand, and a heart clenching with indignation. The insulted man remained silent. He was thin, his jacket frayed at the shoulders, his face gaunt, and his eyes looked as if he hadn't had a full meal in days. But the heartbreaking part was this: he wasn't begging, not pleading, just standing there, as if gathering the last shred of hope that someone would have some kindness. And instead of receiving sympathy, he was shooed away, humiliated, right in front of everyone. Go to a shelter. You're creeping people out. Patrick never thought he would hear this with his own ears, in his own store, a place he had built on the principle everyone deserves to be treated with kindness. He had once been the one who cleaned the kitchens, cleared the tables, and endured endless late-night shifts to make this brand a source of pride. And now, right here at the Columbus branch, he saw that value being trampled on by an employee named Eric, the man behind the food counter, loud and callous. But just as Patrick was about to intervene, someone else stepped forward. It was Whitney, a young woman with curly brown hair who worked at the salad bar, who quietly scooped up a small portion of food, brought it over, and whispered to the hungry man, "Here, just don't tell anyone I gave you this. Okay? No fanfare, no need for applause, just a silent act, at the very moment it was needed most." Patrick stood there, his hand gripping the plastic tray, his heart filled with conflict. One part of him wanted to scream, "How could this happen in my company?" But the other part, calmer, deeper, knew that if he didn't return to face it, then his silence tonight would be complicity with evil. And so, that night, Patrick left the restaurant without eating a single bite. But he knew one thing for sure: tomorrow morning he would be back, no longer as the fake Frank, no longer hiding his face. And this time, everyone would know who he was. Patrick Grant was not the type of CEO who liked to show off. He didn't like being on television, nor did he fancy having his picture in newspapers with business awards. The only thing he truly cared about was people, both customers and employees. 8 years ago, he had acquired the Iron Skillet buffet chain from an elderly couple. At the time, the system was a mess, the food was inconsistent, and employee turnover was dizzying. But Patrick saw what few others did: an old brand could still become a decent place if built from the roots up. He didn't just pour money into it, he personally rebuilt the processes, rewrote every recipe, taught new hires himself how to mop the floors, how to ladle soup without spilling, how to offer a genuine smile instead of a forced one. And most importantly, he raised employee wages, setting ethical standards that were higher than productivity. So, when the numbers from the Columbus branch started to stagnate, he didn't frown because of profits. He frowned because of a strange feeling. Something was wrong, happening there. There were no internal reports about bad behavior, not a single truly serious customer complaint. But Patrick trusted his instincts, and those instincts told him if he just waited, by the time he learned the truth, it might be too late. He booked a table under the fake name Frank Henderson through an internal app the company used to measure anonymous customer experiences, and then he arrived like any other ordinary customer, wearing an old Green Bay Packers hoodie, his face clean-shaven, slightly worn sneakers, and a quiet, observant gaze. No one recognized him as the CEO. No employee looked up and asked, "Are you?" They all thought he was just a middle-aged man looking for a cheap dinner on a tiring day. And in that moment, Patrick saw the truth, the unedited, unreported truth, not shielded by the false pleasantries that usually appear when leadership visits. And that truth had left him stunned silent by Eric's shouting. A place born to nurture kindness. Had someone openly humiliating a hungry person? Patrick could not forgive that. But he couldn't make a rash decision either, because he knew well a toxic culture isn't just because of one person, but because of the leaders who have been silent for too long. Patrick stood at the edge of the line, not yet having reached the food counter, but his mind was already drained by the words that had just echoed. You want food, you pay like everyone else. The thin man still didn't respond. Not a word of apology, no argument. He just stood there, hands limp at his sides, his gaze lowered, as if humiliation was so familiar that there was no room left for tears. Patrick took another step, as if compelled by something deep in his chest. He tilted his head, trying to hear more clearly. I don't care if you're hungry. You're creeping people out. The voice of the employee named Eric was no longer just a refusal. It was filled with contempt. Each sentence was like a small cut into the other man's dignity. And as Patrick prepared to step forward, a slight movement to his left made him pause. A young woman, curly brown hair, wearing a slightly wrinkled apron, quietly bent down behind the salad counter. She said nothing to anyone, showed no expression. She just gently took a small plate, scooped up a few simple food items, and walked over to the hungry man. Here, she said softly, not making eye contact, as if she knew what she was doing would be criticized. Just don't tell anyone I gave you this. Okay. Patrick stood motionless. He couldn't see her face clearly then, but in her eyes he saw something very rare in this system, courage that needed no witness. The other man took the plate as if he were dreaming. His hands trembled, his eyes welled up, and in a voice as raspy as ashes, he whispered, "Thank you." Right then, a harsh sound rang out. "You serious? Whitney, you're just gonna feed every stray now?" Eric, tall, his face flushed red, dramatically throwing a ladle onto the stainless steel counter. Whitney didn't back down. She looked straight at him. He's a person, Eric. Patrick felt as if someone had just closed the distance between him and the real world. This was no longer a situation to analyze profits, or KPIs, or employee productivity. This was a redefinition of human value right in the middle of a budget buffet. He quietly walked to the checkout counter, presenting his reserved ticket, one for the dinner buffet. The cashier looked at him absently. No one suspected a thing. He was just an ordinary middle-aged man, paying cash like any other customer. As he sat down at a table near the window, Patrick's eyes scanned the room. The other man was eating in a hidden corner, each bite slow, as if afraid it would be taken away. Whitney had quietly returned to her station, her hands still trembling slightly, but her eyes held no regret. And Eric was leaning against the counter, scrolling through TikTok on his phone, as if nothing had happened. And Patrick knew, if he didn't act, people like Whitney would always be threatened, while bullies like Eric would continue to hurt others under the guise of following the rules. That night, he didn't eat. He just sat there like a man who had seen too much to turn back. Then he stood up, stepped outside, and immediately called the regional manager. "Hey, this is Pat. I need you to schedule a manager meeting tomorrow morning, store 13. I saw something tonight. We need to talk." The restaurant door closed behind him, and Patrick stood silently on the cracked sidewalk, taking a deep breath in the early spring cold. In front of him was the iron skillet sign, its neon lights flickering weakly, like the weary pulse of life inside. He looked into the glass window. Inside, Whitney was cleaning up the salad bar. Eric was still leaning against the food counter like an uncrowned king, paying no mind to customers or staff. And the man Whitney had helped was gone. No one knew who he was, where he came from, or where he was headed on this cold night. Patrick pulled out his phone and made a quick call to the regional manager. "Liam, it's me. I just visited store 13. Tomorrow morning, I want a meeting with the entire management team. Don't wait for a report. We need to talk urgently." After ending the call, Patrick didn't rush to leave. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on the glass window. For 8 years, he had tried to build a decent system, a place where employees were respected, where people like Whitney didn't have to bow their heads for being kind. But then, that very trust had exposed frightening gaps. When leadership is absent for too long, the wrong people will rise up as if they have the right, and the right people will be pushed back, silenced, or leave. Patrick remembered the look in Whitney's eyes when Eric yelled at her. She wasn't scared, but she was alone. She was standing up to callousness, but no one was defending her. And Patrick knew if he didn't go back, didn't join the ranks of those willing to protect what is right, then that young woman would soon give up. And if he lost people like Whitney, this company would have nothing left worth keeping. That evening, he drove back, with no music on, without having had dinner. The car moved in silence, just like the thoughts tightly coiling in his heart. Patrick had been in places like that before, scrubbing toilets when he was the only one left on the night shift. He had been looked down on when he was just starting out. But it was also in those lowest moments that he met the kind people who lent a hand. People like Whitney, ordinary but compassionate, quiet but capable of shaking an entire system with just a small plate. And he knew, tomorrow, when he returned, it would no longer be as Frank with the hoodie, but as Patrick Grant, CEO, owner. The man who would stand up and reset the entire scale of justice in this restaurant, not for fame, not for profit, but for the trust placed in him from employees like Whitney, from poor customers who dared not look up, and from his own true self. It wasn't quite light yet when Patrick Grant pulled into the parking lot behind the restaurant. The faint morning light spread across the stained pavement, and puddles from last night's rain reflected the glow from the kitchen door. He parked in a hidden corner, out of sight from the main entrance, and quietly entered using an old key fob he had kept since the early days of building this chain. The back door clicked shut softly, no one noticed. Inside, the morning atmosphere was the same as always, rushed, lazy, and disorganized. A young cook was chopping onions with earbuds jammed deep in his ears. The dishwasher hummed as if unattended. Two servers leaned against the counter, scrolling through their phones, their aprons not yet tied. Everything felt as lax as the team's morale. Patrick said nothing. He walked straight into the staff break room and closed the door behind him. Just a few minutes later, the door opened. Christina, the branch manager, walked in with a cup of coffee in her hand and a work schedule checklist. She smiled out of habit. "Good morning." But the sentence cut short as soon as she recognized the person sitting across from her. Her face turned pale, her hand tightening around the coffee cup. Mr. Grant." Patrick looked up, his voice calm but as cold as steel. "Hello. Christina, we need to talk right now." She nodded stiffly. "I'll call the regional manager." "No need. I've already spoken with him. This conversation starts with you." They walked out to the dining area where chairs were still stacked on tables. The floor hadn't been mopped, and the smell of old food and cleaning solution mingled in a strangely unpleasant way. Patrick sat down at the table near the window where he had sat last night with an empty food tray. Christina sat opposite him, her back straight but her eyes avoiding his. Patrick didn't beat around the bush. "I was here last night." Christina was stunned. "I booked a table under a fake name, sat over there, watched everything, every action, every look, every word." She swallowed hard. I had no idea." "You didn't know because you weren't on the floor. Because you let an employee with no title like Eric run this entire space as if he owned it." Christina clasped her hands together, trying to stay calm. Patrick looked straight at her. "I didn't come here to hear a pretty report. I came to see what was really happening, and what I saw was a hungry man being humiliated right in front of customers, not because he was causing trouble, not because he was begging, but simply because he was poor." Christina bowed her head, and the only person who stood up for him was then humiliated by a co-worker. She wasn't protected, she wasn't recognized, she only received threats. "And where were you in your office?" "Once again, not present." She said timidly, "Eric, he's not a manager." "But—" Patrick cut her off. "He doesn't need a title to create a toxic culture. You let him influence how everyone behaves because no one stopped him." The air was as tense as a stretched string. "I want him out of this system immediately." Christina couldn't believe her ears. You want to fire Eric?" Without a warning, Patrick nodded. No warning, no negotiation, not a moment's hesitation. This isn't about productivity. This is about human dignity. Christina was silent. Then she slowly nodded. "I understand." Patrick stood up. "Good. Now call all the employees in. Before the doors open, I need to talk to everyone." Less than 10 minutes later, almost the entire morning shift staff had gathered in the dining area. The chairs were still upside down on the tables. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered slightly from old age. The space was tense and quiet, because everyone could feel that. This was not a typical pre-shift meeting. Patrick stood at the head of the room, with no podium, no signs, no camera crew or media. Just him with a calm face and a voice that was warm, but undeniably firm. "I'm Patrick Grant. I own the Iron Skillet chain. Some of you here know my name, others don't. And that's my fault." The room fell silent. A few employees glanced at each other. Whitney was near the back, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on Patrick, surprised but not scared. Eric was the last to walk in. He yawned widely, his apron still stained from the day before, his hands in his pockets as if this were just another boring roll call. Patrick continued, "I started from scratch, cleaning toilets, mopping greasy floors, working the grill on Friday nights by myself. I've been there. And because I've been there, I believe that anyone who walks into this place deserves to be treated like a human being." He paused. The entire room held its breath. "Last night, I sat at that corner table, watching how everyone worked, and I saw a hungry man standing quietly by the counter, not begging, not causing trouble, just waiting for some glimmer of hope." Patrick clenched his hand slightly, his gaze sweeping over each person. But he didn't receive kindness. He was humiliated, loudly, publicly, in front of customers and co-workers. Eric crossed his arms, shaking his head with a faint smirk. But Patrick didn't let that derail his words. "One of you stepped up, without being told, not for a title, just because it was the right thing to do." His eyes landed on Whitney. She lowered her head slightly, her gaze not wavering. "The other person, the one behind the behavior that made me ashamed of my own company, was you, Eric." Eric dropped his arms, his face hardening. "With all due respect, I don't know who you are. I was just handling the situation like any other day. We can't be giving out food to every homeless person." Patrick cut him off, his voice no longer soft, but sharp as a blade. "You're not being fired for not giving away food. You're being fired for how you spoke, for the contempt in your tone, for turning a human being into a burden." Eric took a step back, his eyes wide. You can't be serious." Patrick stared straight at him. Without blinking, "I am completely serious. As of this moment, you are no longer an employee of Iron Skillet. Get your things and leave." The room held its breath. No one spoke, not a single word of protest. Eric looked around, searching for an ally. No one met his gaze. Even Christina took a small step back, avoiding his line of sight. Eric scoffed, took off his name tag, threw it on a table as a final act of defiance, and walked out the back door without looking back. Patrick looked at everyone. I didn't come here to intimidate you. I came to fix what is broken. And that starts with clarity. Here we help each other. We help our customers. If someone is disrespectful to a customer or a co-worker, they will be gone. No warnings, no negotiations. The group stood silently. Someone swallowed. Someone else bowed their head. Patrick turned to Whitney. You did the right thing without asking for anything, without waiting for praise. Today, I want you to take on a new role, lead server. Starting tomorrow, you'll be trained to become an assistant manager. Whitney's eyes widened. Thank you, sir. I don't think I'm... You don't have to think anything. You deserve it. Patrick looked at everyone one last time. Today is a new day. I'm staying, observing, working alongside you. If you have anything you want to share, whether it's a frustration or an idea, find me. I will listen. He walked over to a nearby chair, flipped it down, and sat. Now, let's open up. The restaurant doors opened just like any other day, but the atmosphere inside was no longer the same. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, the employees stood up straighter. No one was hunched over their phones. No one dared to joke around at the cashier counter or curse in the back kitchen. Something was changing, and everyone could feel it. Whitney didn't say much, but her every action carried weight. She calmly took orders from customers, guided Evan, a new employee, on how to arrange the food trays at the salad bar. When a child spilled orange juice, she didn't scold them, just smiled gently and cleaned it up immediately. Patrick sat quietly in a hidden corner of the restaurant, a cup of black coffee in his hand, his eyes observing every movement. He saw things that internal reports could never show: the reviving heartbeat of an entire system. However, not everyone was okay. Around noon, Patrick noticed Matteo, the young cook in charge of the grill station, hesitate slightly as he turned. He limped toward the prep counter, leaning lightly on the edge of the stainless steel table and breathing out slowly. His chef's coat was stained with sweat. His back was soaked. A long line of tickets still hung above the grill, as if in defiance. Patrick stood up and walked into the kitchen area. He didn't say anything, just opened the fridge, grabbed a bottle of cold water, and handed it to Matteo. You've been on the grill since 8. Matteo nodded, not looking up. Jason called out. I think he quit. Management didn't have anyone else, so I just tried to manage. Patrick frowned. Is your leg hurting? Matteo shrugged, about to say, it's fine, but Patrick had already seen the truth. Slipped at home last week. Just a little twinge. I thought I could handle it. Patrick was silent for a second. Then he took a step back, unhooked an apron from a hook, and quickly tied it around his waist. Go take a 10-minute break. I'll cover the grill. Matteo's eyes widened. You know how to cook. Patrick gave a very slight smile. I once fried over 200 pieces of chicken on a Friday night shift. Trust me. Without waiting, he put on gloves, picked up the meat spatula, and started working as if he had never left the kitchen. His movements were neat and rhythmic. The meat was cooked evenly, and the dishes came out in the right order. A few young cooks glanced over, then immediately turned back, as if ashamed of how lazy they had been for so long. Whitney walked by, saw Patrick at the grill, and her eyes widened. Never thought I'd see this day. Patrick didn't take his eyes off the grill. Have you ever seen someone limping but not daring to ask for a break? Whitney nodded, her voice low, more often than you'd think. Patrick flipped the meat a few more times, then exhaled. Then we have more work to do than I thought. By the time Matteo returned, the tickets were almost all cleared. He walked over, embarrassed. Did you really cook all these dishes? I was just keeping the rhythm until you got back. But next time, don't stay silent when you're in pain. Your job is to do good work, not to sacrifice yourself silently to cover someone else's shift. Matteo nodded slightly. In his eyes there was both gratitude and surprise. It was clear no one had ever said that to him before. Patrick took off his gloves, patted him lightly on the shoulder, and returned to the dining hall. He knew real change doesn't come from long speeches. It starts with very small things, like a cook getting a timely break because the person in charge was willing to step into the kitchen. After the lunch rush, the pace of the restaurant slowed down a bit. Patrick had been sitting for less than 5 minutes when a quiet but sharp voice from the dessert counter cut through the calm. No, that's not how you refill the trays. I told you 5 times already. Patrick turned his head and saw a woman in a neat shirt holding a clipboard, pointing her finger close to a young employee's face. The young man, about 19, was blushing with embarrassment, clutching a ladle as if he didn't know what to do with it anymore. You're not listening. When the tray is below half, you replace it, not top it off. It's right here, clearly marked. The woman practically shoved the clipboard at him as if threatening him, not letting the situation escalate. Patrick stood up and walked straight over, his voice low but firm. Everything all right here? The woman turned around, startled. When she saw Patrick, her eyes flickered with caution. Oh, Mr. Grant, I didn't know you were still on site. I am, and you are, Danielle Foster, corporate training consultant. I'm here for the quarterly compliance audit. Patrick nodded slowly and then turned to the young employee who was looking down. You good, Evan? The young man nodded slightly but still didn't look up. Patrick turned back to Danielle. His voice was still calm but forceful. I appreciate you being here, but this isn't how we train people. Danielle frowned, maintaining her professional demeanor. I'm just making sure policies are followed, sir. The trainee misunderstood the refill chart. Patrick crossed his arms, interrupting her calmly but allowing no escape. He's a new hire, not a punching bag. Correction is one thing. Public humiliation is another. Danielle started to get flustered. I didn't mean to humiliate. You raised your voice. You pointed at him. You made him feel incompetent in front of customers. That's not coaching. Danielle, that's intimidation. A long moment of silence followed. A few other employees standing nearby pretended to wipe tables, but were clearly listening to every word. Danielle gripped her clipboard, trying to salvage the situation. I'll adjust my tone going forward. No, you'll step away from the floor. Effective immediately. She opened her mouth as if to protest, but Patrick looked directly into her eyes with a kind of non-negotiable determination, HR will follow up with you about this. But for now, I need you off the line." Danielle froze. Without another word, she turned and walked straight toward the office behind the kitchen. No clipboard, no looking back. Patrick turned to Evan. The young man now looked at him in disbelief. "You're doing fine, Evan. If anything confuses you, ask Whitney or Mateo. They've got your back." Evan nodded repeatedly, his voice tiny. "Yes, sir. Thank you." Patrick nodded, patted him lightly on the shoulder, and returned to the dining area. In his eyes, this incident, though small, was a clear symptom of a larger disease, a culture of fear, where training was done through intimidation, not trust. He had just sat down when he saw a little girl, about 7 years old, standing by the soda fountain, holding a plastic cup that had overflowed, her eyes wide as if she were about to cry. Patrick immediately walked over and knelt down to her level. "You okay?" The little girl nodded slightly. "I spilled my drink. No big deal. Where's your table?" She pointed to the corner. Patrick followed her gaze. Whitney had already seen, and was approaching with a new cup and a cloth in her hand. She bent down to wipe up the spill, handed the new cup to the little girl, and gave a small wink that made her smile. The father, from a distance, gave a slight nod of thanks to Whitney. Patrick watched the scene, then pulled out his phone. Just one line in a text message. "Need Whitney's personnel file. Starting assistant manager, onboarding next week." He didn't need a survey. He didn't need a meeting. That girl deserved to lead. The afternoon light softened outside the glass window, filtering through the thin curtains and calming the atmosphere in the restaurant. The post-lunch rush had passed, leaving only small groups of customers chatting and eating leisurely in a space that was more peaceful than usual. Whitney emerged from the back, adjusting her apron. She was no longer an employee hiding at the salad bar like the night before. Her gaze was more confident now, each step carrying weight. People were starting to look to her as a leader. Patrick, sitting at a table near the window, watched without blinking. He knew the true power of a leader doesn't lie in authority, but in others choosing to listen to you, even when they aren't forced to. The front door chimed softly. A woman entered in her mid-40s, looking tired, her hair tied back in a hasty bun. On her shirt was a plastic name tag, School Security Officer, East Side Middle. She looked around, holding a takeout menu, and walked slowly to the checkout counter. Whitney approached, smiling. "Hi, how can I help you?" The woman gave a weak, slightly embarrassed smile. I only have about $6. I just got off my shift. Wanted to get something to take home. Maybe just a few side dishes." She wasn't begging, not pleading. Just a tired person trying to hold on to the last bit of dignity after a long day guarding school hallways. The cashier glanced at Whitney, her eyes asking, "What now?" Patrick remained seated in his far corner, not intervening. He waited to see if yesterday's kindness was just a reflex, or if it had become the standard. Whitney didn't hesitate. She nodded, her smile warm. "You know what? We have something called a community plate. When we can, We use it to help someone who needs a decent meal. You can pick any 3 items from the hot counter. I'll pack them up for you to go." The woman was stunned, her eyes suddenly turning red. "Really? Really? No strings attached. We call it helping without asking why." The atmosphere seemed to stand still for a few seconds. The woman, choked with emotion, managed a smile. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Whitney turned to the cashier. "Log it in the community plate book. I'll sign off on it." Patrick leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes shining with deep satisfaction. No cameras, no speeches, no rewards. But this was what he wanted, to build a system where kindness was the standard, not the exception. And this time, no one smirked, no one jeered. The employees standing nearby even gave a slight nod. One helped with an extra bag. Another held the door open. Compassion had spread not through slogans, but through repeated, consistent action. Patrick opened his phone and quickly texted the regional manager, "Add community plate to the employee handbook for the entire system. Needs to be piloted throughout the eastern region." The school security officer walked out the door, a bag of hot food in her hand. She didn't say another word. But when she glanced back, her grateful eyes met Whitney's directly. And Whitney, without needing a single word of praise, just gave a slight nod, a familiar gesture, as if doing a kind thing was never strange. Late in the afternoon, as the restaurant passed its peak and began to slow down, Patrick stood in front of the shift schedule board in the office. Employee names were written in marker, interspersed with question marks, transfer arrows, and double shifts circled in red ink, a chaotic picture of shortages, patches, and exhaustion. Patrick took a long breath and then went into the staff break room, which had been tidied up. He sat down at a plastic table, his hands clasped together, and waited. Whitney was the first to enter. She sat in the chair opposite him, her posture straight but not tense. Her hands were clasped together on her lap, not out of fear, but out of respect for the conversation that was about to begin. Patrick gave a small smile. "I'm not going to ask you about sales or procedures. Today, I just want to know one thing." Whitney nodded slightly. "What's the worst part of this job?" She didn't need to think. The answer came out almost immediately. The feeling that I'm the only one who cares when things go wrong. Patrick was silent for a few seconds. "That's the most honest answer I've heard in many years." Whitney looked at him, frankly. "But yesterday, when you stepped out of the shadows and dealt with Eric, that feeling changed. Not completely, but it's different now. I'm still worried I'll become the kind of manager who sits in a cold office, doesn't listen to anyone, and doesn't see what's really happening. If so, then I don't want the promotion." Patrick leaned forward, his gaze deepening. A real manager is someone who dares to stand up when no one else will. Someone who sets boundaries that others believe in. Someone who listens and keeps their word. You've already done that, even without the title. Starting next week, you'll begin shadowing Christina. You'll learn about timekeeping, scheduling, supplier calls, and also working with people who aren't like you. Whitney was slightly stunned. "You really believe I can do it?" Patrick nodded. I don't believe in you because you haven't made mistakes, but because you know what's right, even when it comes at a cost. She looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "Then I won't let you down." Patrick smiled slightly. "If you ever see something wrong from a customer, a co-worker, or even a superior, and you can't tell anyone, you can call me directly. No intermediaries." He held out a small business card with a handwritten phone number on the back. Whitney took it, speechless. You're giving me your personal number. I don't give it to many people, but I don't want to lose you." There was no fanfare, no tears, just a conversation between someone who wanted to lead and someone willing to give a chance. Whitney stood up, clutching the card tightly in her hand. "Thank you, sir. I won't stay silent anymore. Not for anyone." Patrick gave a slight nod, saying nothing more. He just watched silently as she walked out of the room, her posture more solid than ever before. After Whitney. The next person to enter the break room was Matteo, still limping a little. But his face was less pained, his eyes less avoidant. He sat down, slightly hunched over, as if still expecting a reprimand. Patrick didn't make him wait long. "I owe you an apology." Matteo was startled, looking up. "What, sir? I let a young man like you carry the weight of the kitchen while injured just because you thought you had no other choice." He bowed his head. "I didn't want to be a bother. I honestly thought if I took a break, everything would fall apart. And so, you chose to endure without reporting it, without asking for time off, without saying a word." Matteo sighed. "I need the hours. I can't lose a shift." Patrick nodded, his gaze softening. "I understand, but this is a bigger issue than a shift. If I let a good employee like you burn out and quit, or worse, suffer a long-term injury, then the whole system loses the people most worth keeping." He took a small file folder from his coat pocket. "From today until the end of the week, you'll be on cold prep and light inventory, still at full hours and pay. Early next week. If your knee is better, we'll adjust again." Matteo's eyes widened, moved. You don't have to do that. I'm fine. I'm not doing it because I have to. I'm doing it because I must. You are an asset to the team, and a good team doesn't burn out its talent, it invests in it." Patrick paused for a beat, then continued. "I'm also looking for someone to train for the role of kitchen team lead." Matteo seemed to hold his breath. "I want you to try. No pressure, but I see potential in how you work. You don't blame, you don't complain. You just step up when no one else does. That's the mark of a leader." Matteo looked at him, almost in disbelief. I never thought I could." "You don't have to think about it today. You just need to learn. When you're ready, the door will be open, and I'll be there, waiting." Matteo nodded, smiling slightly for the first time that day genuinely. "Thank you, sir." He left, his walk still slow, but his back was noticeably straighter. A little later, Christina walked in. She was holding a thick folder filled with reports, schedules, and order forms, all sorts of paperwork organized neatly. as if to prove a point. Patrick held up a hand. "Put it down. I don't need paperwork today. I need the truth." Christina hesitated but placed the folder on the table and sat down, exhaling. "I know I let things slide. I know I let people like Eric have too much influence. I was tired." Patrick nodded. "I don't doubt that you were trying. I doubt how alone you were while trying." Christina looked up, her eyes welling up. "I just wanted to keep things from falling apart. People quitting without notice, new hires not lasting. I was just patching things up. I kept thinking if I could just endure for one more week, it would be okay. And that's when you stopped reporting, stopped asking for help. You chose silence, and that silence allowed the wrong people to overpower the right ones." She nodded slightly, fully accepting it for the first time. "I was wrong." Patrick didn't repeat it. He just said, "You have a chance. 1 quarter. 12 weeks. During that time, I want to see Whitney and Matteo developed properly. I want to see new employees guided with patience, not yelling. And I want to see you lead, not just hold on." Christina sat silently for a few seconds, then said softly, "And if I can do it, then the regional supervisor position for the North is vacant. I don't need someone perfect. I need someone who knows when they're wrong, fixes it, and dares to change." Christina looked at him, as if a weight she had carried for months had been lifted from her shoulders. "I won't let you down. I don't need you to promise that. I just need you to act." The afternoon settled slowly. Inside the restaurant, the soft lights were turned on earlier than usual. There was no more clattering of trays, no more scolding between the kitchen counter and the service station, no more harsh glares. Everything seemed to have found a new rhythm, quieter, but more solid. Whitney was checking the payment area, helping a new employee fix a receipt printer error. She didn't shout, didn't give orders, just pointed gently and nodded when everything was fixed correctly. Matteo, in the back kitchen, was slowly restocking food trays in the fridge, his limp less pronounced, his steps more careful and confident. Patrick leaned lightly against the kitchen doorway, watching everyone with silent eyes, like a father watching his children learn to stand on their own. No one was running from their work anymore, nor was anyone afraid every time a leader walked by. They didn't need to pretend to be professional because they were truly working with responsibility and self-respect. At the end of the day, as the last customers left, the team began their closing duties. Without being told, the floors were cleaned, trays were cleared, and the dessert counter was carefully covered. One person mopped, another washed dishes, another checked inventory. Everyone knew their job, and more importantly, they knew why they were doing it. Patrick put on his coat and walked to the front desk. Christina was closing out the cash register. Whitney had just finished wiping down the counter and turned around just as Patrick approached. He looked around and said softly, "You all did a good job today." Whitney smiled. Today felt different, like everyone actually started to care. Patrick nodded, his voice deep but clear. "That's because you made it different. Not me. I just removed the things that were stopping kindness from living where it belongs." Christina stood beside him, a genuine smile on her face for the first time since the story began. "We'll keep this rhythm." Patrick turned to look at each person, as if to commit their image to his memory. "I'll be back in 2 weeks, but from now on, I'll still be watching, not to supervise, but to learn what's really changing." He turned to leave, but as he neared the door, Whitney's voice called out from behind him, "Mr. Grant." Patrick stopped and turned his head. "Thank you for not just coming to punish, but for staying long enough to fix things." A moment of silence, then Patrick gave a slight nod. "Fixing is easy. Keeping it right is what takes everyone together." He pushed the door open and stepped into the cool evening air. The iron skillet sign, once flickering, once a source of shame for him, was now shining steadily, brightly, and simply. A small change, but a sign of something much bigger. On the drive home, Patrick didn't turn on the music. There was no need. The echo from a reviving restaurant was the warmest symphony right now. And he knew, if this company could become better, it didn't need more rules. It needed people like Whitney, like Matteo, like Christina, who dared to do what was right, quietly, resiliently, not for a title, but because they believed. Kindness is the only thing that should be spread unconditionally. Sometimes you don't need power to change a system. You just need enough courage to do what's right. A plate of food given in silence, a gaze that doesn't turn away, and a leader willing to stay long enough to listen instead of just giving orders. The world doesn't change through grand proclamations. It changes through ordinary people who don't let kindness disappear in silence. Who will you be in this story?